My name is Christina Cogdell, and I'm the chair of the Department of Design. I'm honored to be here today welcoming Jenny Sabin, our esteemed guest for the third annual Alberini Family Lecture Series in Design. 3 years ago, we received an inspirational gift from Carlos and Andrea Alberini and their family to endow this speaker series. Their goal was to allow us to bring internationally renowned designers to UC Davis in order to provide interactive learning opportunities for our students and to leverage our outstanding design program into national and international prominence. Their philanthropy has set the stage for these incredible events. Carlos Alberini led the way with a lecture himself in the first year discussing power of strategy, design, and brand transformation. Carlos is now the CEO of Guess as well. He was of Lucky Brand at that point. We also then last year had Damon Rich and Rostin Wu. They talked about design for democracy. And today we welcome Jenny Sabin to discuss some of the most interesting and cutting-edge architectural design that crosses all kinds of borders. Endowments like the Alberini Lecture Fund are truly transformational. They allow departments and programs to plan for the future, to take our next steps in programming, and to invest in the success of our faculty and students. Even though they were unable to make it today, I want to definitely thank Carlos and Andrea and their family for investing in the Department of Design here at UC Davis. Their support allows us to strive and achieve new things every day. My thanks also to all of you for being so patient, for sticking around, for making exquisite corpse, and joining us here now for this great lecture. I now want to move to my introduction of Jenny herself. So Jenny is the Weissenberger Professor in Architecture and the Director of Graduate Studies at the Department of Architecture at Cornell University, where she has established a new advanced research degree in matter, design, computation. She is principal of Jenny Sabin Studio, an experimental architecture design studio in Ithaca, New York, and she directs the Sabin Lab at Cornell. She holds degrees in ceramics and interdisciplinary visual art from the University of Washington, and a Master of Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania, all with top honors. Before completing her architectural degree in 2005, she was a practicing visual artist based in Seattle, Washington. I had the honor of meeting and actually learning from, studying with Jenny. I was her student between 2008 and 2009 when I was a postdoctoral research at the University of Pennsylvania, studying her collaboration known as Lab Studio. At the time, Lab Studio was an absolutely unique collaboration between an architect, Jenny, and molecular biologist Peter Lloyd Jones, who was a professor and biomedical researcher at Penn's Institute for Medicine and Engineering. I participated in their class, Nonlinear Systems, Biology, and Design, along with students from architecture, molecular biology, biophysics, mathematics, and pharmacology. This class met both in the biology lab and in the architecture computer lab, as students observed experiments and translated biological and visual data into architectural forms that offered new insights. Although Jenny trained as a ceramic artist and then as architect, she has maintained a lifelong love of biology and mathematics, interweaving all of these into her career as a path-breaking academic, artist, designer, and architect. She exhibits her creative work internationally at the most cutting-edge exhibitions. She won the Museum of Modern Art's Young Architects Program at MoMA PS1 in 2017, and was invited to present her work both at the Centre Pompidou in Paris in 2017 and at the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum Triennial in 2016. Her recent works can be described as, quote, lightweight knitted canopy, structures of responsive tubular and cellular components that employ digitally woven textiles, and photoluminescent solar active fibers that absorb, collect, and deliver light, end quote. In 2017, she won Architectural Records Women in Architecture Innovator Award, following prestigious awards such as the Architectural League Prize for Young Architects in 2014 and a Pew Fellowship in the Arts in 2010. Her work is sometimes described as architextiles, and it's been included in Ars Electronica, SIGGRAPH, as well as the Frock Center in Orleans, France. In 2012, she was one of 6 international innovators to create a piece for Nike as part of their Flyknit collective. Her piece seamlessly merges her keen biological perception at the cellular scale with advanced digital weaving to create a space explored by viewers walking into it, immersed on all sides. This transformation of scale is but one of Sabin's strengths that she brings to her collaborations with scientists and engineers. Her across scales architectural thinking and modeling have recently been focused on 2 National Science Foundation FREC grants, exploring energy minimization and how the nano and cellular scales can inform new approaches to architecture at the macro level. Her book with Peter Lloyd-Jones, Lab Studio, Design Research Between Architecture and Biology, was published by Routledge in 2017. And in 2018, she was awarded a $30,000 Frontiers of Engineering grant to pursue research on sustainability and aesthetics in solar panels, along with her engineering collaborator, Mariana Bertoni. This impressive interdisciplinarity is reinforced by the fact that her creative work has been featured on the cover of the American Journal of Pathology and Science magazine. Jenny is also an expert scripter, serving as a senior tutor for the Smart Geometry group that integrates advanced mathematics with computational coding to open new territory for generative architectural design. She's served on the board of Acadia, the Association for Computer-Aided Design in Architecture, and she's a member of the organization Arc in Tex, an international network where architecture, interaction design, and textiles join forces. Sabin's in-betweenness is what makes her work so incredibly creative and eye-opening. She walks fluidly between disciplines, merging them, between scales, making the micro into the macro, all the while with the precision of a mathematician, scientist, scripter, combined with the intuitive vision of an artist. Like her own boundary and scale-crossing modes, I place no limits on her talent, creativity, and imagination. She tackles new technologies almost as soon as they appear and integrates them into her portfolio of skills. She inspires me for all the right reasons, from her creativity, ingenuity, and brilliance to her fearlessness, composure, we'll see about that today after arriving so late, leadership, generosity, and personal warmth. Please help me welcome Jenny Sabin.
See if that works. Is that good? Let me get this a little closer. There we go. Well, first of all, thank you, Christina, for that very warm and generous introduction. And thank you, all of you, for your patience and staying an extra hour to get started. I started my journey at about 3 in the morning, your time, and sat on a tarmac for 3 hours due to heavy fog in Ithaca, but I'm here and I'm so thankful to be here. So thanks for your patience. I want to thank UC Davis and especially Christina Kogdell for the generous and kind invitation, and also especially to participate in this exciting Alberini lecture series. So tonight I will address the subject of my talk through the lens of my transdisciplinary collaborations, with an interest in developing an alternative material practice in architecture. And this is done through the generative fabrication of the nonlinearities of material and form across disciplinary boundaries. At heart, I'm a maker. I'm interested in how emerging technologies meet the material world and the built environment. I'm going to start by talking about the foundation for this work. I'll talk a bit about some of the key people, collaborators that have inspired me and influenced my thinking over the years. And then I'll move into 3 different topics, and within each one I will describe both fundamental research ongoing in my lab as well as applied projects in my practice. Now, certainly biology and material science present useful conceptual models for architects to consider, where form is in constant adaptation with environmental events. It's here that geometry and matter operate together as an active, elastic ground, what I like to call a datascape, that steers and specifies form, function, and structure, and importantly, in context. It's through direct references to the flexibility and sensitivity of the human body as a point of departure that I'm interested in developing adaptive materials and architecture where code, pattern, environmental cues, geometry, and matter operate together as a conceptual design space. Now, we frequently start a project with very, very simple parts and rules. The cardinal feature to complexity is simplicity. That through feedback and iteration produce much more complex spatial wholes. Now, this interest also engages the productive tinkering and misuse of digital fabrication machines, oftentimes found in alternate industries, such as in the textile industry, looking at digital knitting and weaving, and also the automotive industry, working with robotics and six-axis robotic arms. Now, this is also informed by issues of craft and making to produce bio-inspired material systems and software design tools that importantly have the capacity to facilitate embedded expressions in our built environment. And similar to a very important mentor to me, Detlef Mertens, who coined the term Bioconstructivisms, the emphasis here is upon the analogic negotiation of morphological behavior as a dynamic template that is then filtered through material organizations to produce models that on the one hand are natural and on the other are artificial. And so we purposefully resist the post-rationalization of complex form. I've never been interested, for example, in taking what might be a beautiful cellular form or a data set operating at a micron scale and simply scaling that up into architecture, but really to look beyond the image, to look at the processes and the behaviors that have governed those morphologies. And importantly, to look at how applications can happen on both sides of the fence in terms of architecture, biomedicine, robotics, biological engineering, and beyond. So one of the fundamental questions that drives both the research and my project work and my practice is how might buildings behave more like organisms, responding to and adapting to their built environments? And I believe in the not-so-distant future, materials will not just be elements and things and buildings, but that they will generate immersive spaces, acting upon and responding to affordances in our built environments. And so like the very cells in our own bodies, sensors and imagers will learn and adapt, making materials not only smart, but also aware, sensate, and beautiful. And hopefully we will be able to tune our environments to personalize architecture. So as Christina mentioned, Dr. Peter Lloyd-Jones is a longtime collaborator, someone who has deeply inspired me and informed a lot of my thinking. And in 2006, we launched what we believe at that time was the first truly hybrid research and design unit, where biologists worked alongside architects and architecture students on common problems and questions. And Peter introduced me to the extracellular matrix, and he's a trained matrix biologist. And these are some of the cardinal features of the extracellular matrix. But the big idea here is that, sure, you have DNA, you have code, but half the secret of life resides outside of the cell. So that DNA is acted upon by protein events that occur within that extracellular matrix. And so very early on, starting in 2005, that presented to me and my students a series of very powerful ecological thinking models to look at how context specifies form, function, and structure as a dynamic reciprocity. We recently published a book on the methods and findings of Lab Studio, which has served as the foundation for where I'm at now and also my lab at Cornell. It's really a book about communication across disciplinary boundaries and how we did that successfully through projects and also fundamental research. Another important collaborator who I continue to collaborate with formally, Dr. Xu Yang. She is a materials scientist engaged in biomimicry in the true definition of the word. She's interested in developing new materials by looking to nature for models such as the leaves of lotus plants, the feet of gecko, to produce materials that are superhydrophilic or superhydrophobic. And we specifically have been looking at one topic, that being structural color, and I'll talk briefly about that through one of our early research projects called eSkin. And then more recently, I've been working with Dan Lau, who's a biological engineer at Cornell University, and he's doing incredible work with 3D printed hydrogels that are infused with synthetic DNA to program matter, to get materials to actuate on their own accord in variable contexts. And I'll come back to that in a moment in terms of what we have been doing together collaboratively. So over the years, the work has been formalized into 3 phases. Importantly, when Peter and I started collaborating and teaching together and bringing students on board as research associates, we purposefully did not set any strict goals. The only goal that we had was to, at the very least, form some new questions and, at best, applications both in architecture and biomedicine. And I will say that one of the most important investments of time that we made, if I look back over almost 15 years now, is that we spent a full year just figuring out how to talk to each other. So he would come to my studio reviews, I would attend his lab meetings. I had to let a lot of information just sort of flow over me. And Peter was completely freaked out by the culture of the critique and what we were subjecting our students to. And we quickly found that even though we had some like terms in terms of language, we had very different definitions for those terms. Very different structures for how we garner funds, how we teach, how we publish, how we lead our days. And so it was through the course of that year, in forging that common ground, that we decided to launch Lab Studio and also the affiliated courses that Christina mentioned. So we typically start by the development of tools. I like to think of software as a new type of material to model behavior that might be of a particular cellular data set or a particular material or an abstract mathematical concept. And then some of those tools are brought into the realm of architectural prototyping, so productively contaminating the process with the stuff of making, and also starting to integrate architectural constraints. So that also, in a way, begins to responsibly deal with the problem of scale. Right, so I mentioned we don't just simply scale up what we might find in natural systems into architecture, but to look at how those processes and behaviors can be leveraged across scalar boundaries. And then some of those prototypes are brought into the realm of buildings and thinking about the built environment. So it's a purposefully slow process. And so as I mentioned, our focus is on the processes and the behaviors behind those images and morphologies to really discern how context is influencing the production of form. And so similar to these illustrations and drawings, one of which is by John Piper here, which was used as the front piece for Conrad Waddington's book, Organizers and Genes. And in this particular drawing, he intended to represent the epigenetic landscape. And we see a rare view behind the scenes of Waddington's landscape. Each valley in the landscape is formed by tension on guide ropes that are attached to nodes of genes, where everything is parametrically and inextricably linked. And adjacent to that is an early drawing by Robert Laricollay, a hero of mine. And these drawings, although historic, look quite contemporary. He's the father of the space frame and corrugated sheet metal. And he was obsessed with radiolarian creatures. But importantly, he didn't just simply copy their exoskeletons, but he was obsessed with looking at the flow of forces through geometry and matter. So he didn't start out by saying, I'm going to invent the space frame, pretty important system. But that emerged through a series of investigations of analogic models and drawing and studying how surfaces were designed within these little micron scale creatures. So I'm going to transition into the first topic now that I've talked a little bit about the foundation for the thinking and the work and some of the key people involved. And of course, there are many others. And this starts with adaptive materials and looking at that fundamental question that I posed in terms of considering how buildings might behave more like organisms, adapting to and responding to their environments, with the promise that we as humans might begin to personalize our own spaces. And this is with eSkin. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this project, but I will touch upon some key topics that are relevant. In 2010, we were fortunate to receive a multi-million-dollar grant from the National Science Foundation. And it was during that year that the NSF put out a call for collaborative teams that would include architects, which was unprecedented at the time. And we had a few years of collaboration and experience under our belts through Lab Studio, which proved to actually be a key asset in terms of the assessment of our proposal. And so this was the team, which included biologists, material scientists, architects, and mechanical engineers. And we pitched a point of departure that had to do with this notion of dynamic reciprocity. And specifically, the NSF was interested in collaborative teams that would address sustainability in buildings, specifically building heat gain. But importantly, they were interested in how we potentially could fundamentally reconceptualize our whole approach to the problem of sustainability, which still is focused on resource consumption instead of considering life cycle and feedback and cyclic natures of materials and resources. And so what you see here is a smooth muscle cell, a human cell, plated onto an organic polymer, which is called PDMS. And we were interested, again, going back to the ECM and the cardinal features of the extracellular matrix, and how changes in geometry and patterning and compliance, materiality, and so on, would influence the behavior of the cell. And so you can actually see its internal cytoskeleton lassoing up and around these pillars, the nucleus stained in blue, and so on. Now, we by no means were proposing to put human cells on building skins. Human cells work extremely well in our own bodies, but at the scale of a building skin, they would quickly become confluent and they would die. But at this scale, they were our muse. We were interested in how we could extract these behaviors and cardinal features and characteristics, and then together with the mechanical engineers, leverage that towards the design and engineering of sensors, imagers, and materials that would be locally done, but potentially could learn over time, adapting to their contexts. And so we pitched in the proposal that we would develop thin film technology that could be integrated into either existing construction within buildings or in new facade design. And so just to give you a little bit of insight as to some of the specifics of what we were looking at, we began to narrow down the vast number of parameters that we potentially could work with and focused on structural color. And structural color is different from pigment, in the sense that it entirely has to do with the wavelength of light. So it has to do with how light interacts with materials and how we in turn perceive those changes. And so this is an example of a predefined geometric pattern that has been fabricated through photolithography, and it's embedded within what's called a shape memory polymer. And it's displaying structural color change. And so simply what's happening when I stretch this E-skin material, right, so it undergoes a mechanical change, those holes or those pillars change their orientation, so they move from being normal to that surface to being something like this. And in turn, that changes how light is reflecting and refracting, interacting with the texture of that material, its patterning, because they're operating at the same scale. And we, in turn, perceive a color change, right? So it has everything to do with light and perception. So we were interested in working with those behaviors, looking at the potential of not only color change, but dynamically switching from opaque to transparent. My collaborators, the mechanical engineers, Jan and Nader, absolutely amazing. They were interested in concepts such as making a building disappear. So we were equally interested in the functional and optimal characteristics of E-skin alongside issues of beauty and aesthetics, and what large-scale transformations of building skins might do to people in urban settings and beyond. And so through a series of exhibition invitations, we began to test the possibilities, first through simulation. We had to develop all of our own simulation tools to render the E-skin data. So this was looking at a typical hypothetical facade unit and how people could interact with at least the data to start with in simulation mode, also at a room scale, and finally looking at the development of a full-scale prototype operating at a human scale that literally took us 2 years to design and produce, working collaboratively at the bench side and in the studio with both the material scientists, the engineers, and my team. And we were interested in how we could potentially dynamically switch between opaque to transparent and also display a colorful arrangement. One thing that we came up against had to do with this problem of scale, because some characteristics and features are scalable and others are not. And one of the hurdles that we came up against was that it was going to be prohibitively expensive to fabricate swaths of E-skin at the scale that we hope to achieve. And so, for example, it was not only prohibitively expensive, it was going to take us quite a long time to fabricate these little panels. So even though we were working with swaths that are about 4 centimeters by 4 centimeters, which is huge for Shu and her team, and very small for me and my team, and I'm thinking, you know, we've proposed to make building skins, how are we going to do this? And so we switched to another material that exhibited the same characteristics, but that we could begin to scale. And that's called Nanocollidal Particles. And these little guys are found in seashells, such as oyster shells called nacre, certain milk products, and beyond. And after 2 years, we produced this. This is now part of the permanent collection at the Froc in Orléans, just outside of Paris. And just to give you a little bit of insight into what's going on here, there's an array of components that are composed of 2 sheets of conductive glass called ITO glass and an array of sensors that detect a change in light intensity. And so when I pass my hand by this, we were able to tune it with some potentiometers in the back to various spaces. Those sensors detect a change in light intensity and in turn send a very low voltage regionally, which then changes the packing density of those little nanocollidal particles, and we perceive a color change or a dynamic switch from opaque to transparent. This is our hope. This is where we are now. This is what we hope to achieve. And currently looking for industry partners to work with fabrication technologies such as roll-to-roll manufacturing, and really potentially to bring this into a viable product that could reach the building industry. And I will say, from start to finish, from fundamental research that's being funded by the NSF at the sort of point of departure to a viable product that's out in the world being used, you're typically looking at, ideally, if you're lucky, about 15 years of work and various funding collaborations. All of our success with the eSkin project then led to another NSF grant that we secured. We were fortunate in 2013 to secure another multi-million-dollar grant, leveraging what we had developed with eSkin, but this time looking at a particular geometric system. The National Science Foundation put out a call for collaborative teams to engage origami, broadly speaking. And we were interested in not just origami, but looking at kirigami, which is like origami, but with the addition of cuts and holes, and in turn to think about how we could move away from single swaths or films of the eSkin into larger assemblies that would also fold and adapt and change across multiple scales. And if you're interested in terms of what funding arm we've been working with, the experimental arm within the NSF is the Emerging Frontiers for Research Innovation. They're interested in funding weird, transformative collaborations. So take a look at their calls. We've fortunately been successful. So we're going to listen to Randy Kamian, who's a theoretical physicist, talk about kirigami.
Kirigami and origami are closely related. In origami, we usually focus just on folding the paper. In kirigami, we are also allowed to cut it. Cutting it adds a new dimension to the structures we can build. Without folding paper over itself, it is possible to make three-dimensional pop-up structures. In fact, with a little tape or a staple, we can make the structures completely rigid, or, left as they are, we can use them as levers and valves. By following a simple set of rules, we can keep not only the paper from stretching, but also all the bonds or edges in the original hexagonal sheet from stretching. We can see where the paper pops up or down by seeing where the hexagons become pentagons or heptagons, respectively. Put together, these folds and cuts can be made into complex, variegated structures.
So this paradox of building with holes you find everywhere in nature, and that was our point of departure. We spent the first year working closely with Randy, developing tools and algorithms to model the precise geometries coming forth from kirigami processes and methods. We also looked at the integration of material constraints coming forth from Shu's lab, constantly working back and forth between digital investigation, simulation, analog model production, and also importantly working across scales. And one particular prototype that was quite useful and successful is color folds, where you can see in this rendering what we were interested in engaging in terms of forming a bridge between eSkin and then larger assemblies that could also fold and unfold that would be laminated with a wavelength-dependent film. And in this project, we integrated physical computing. I typically don't engage with this type of technology, not because I'm not interested, but we tend to focus on the design of the actual materials themselves in terms of programmable matter and getting them to actuate in various environments. But for this project, it made sense. I will never, ever do it again. For those of you that have worked with these systems, you probably know why. Just a little bit of detail. Each foldable component had its own little brain, a microprocessor, thermistors to control the heat, and a whole network of nitinol spring that would then send small regional charges to get these things to actuate, fold, and unfold accordingly. And there was a basic learning algorithm that ran throughout the network. So when one component began to fold and unfold, its neighbor would say, okay, well, I guess I better do the same thing. So you can see here the success of the wavelength-dependent film. Same material, but with this photograph, they're all at different angles. So we see this quite complex arrangement of different colors based on how it's behaving with not only our view of the project, but also the way that light is interacting with the material itself. And just a little side note, one of the biggest hurdles that we came up against, those of you that have worked with these systems before probably know what it is, had to do with simply getting enough power for the whole network to actuate. And on the opening night of this on Cornell's campus, I ran down to the local auto store and bought 2 car batteries, and we hooked it up, and that did the trick. So if you visit my lab and wonder why we have car batteries as doorstops, that's why. Which brings me to my second topic, which is related to adaptive materials, but is a bit differentiated in terms of looking at other types of technologies and also beginning to jump scale, and specifically looking at part-to-whole relationships and the promise of adaptive structures and form. And when I say adaptive structures, I don't necessarily mean literally moving, but looking to natural systems and their variegated nature in terms of part-to-whole relationships and considering how that may inform design strategies for some of these contemporary fabrication protocols, such as with 3D printing. And so in 2009, we purchased our first powder-based printer. This was at Lab Studio when I was still teaching at Penn. I taught at Penn in the Graduate School of Architecture for 6 years before accepting my position in 2011 at Cornell. And Peter and I were interested in using the 3D printer not as a representational tool, but specifically to look at the rapid manufacturing of parts at a one-to-one scale. And on Peter's end, he was very interested in the promise of what it might be like to hold data. How might holding data, 3D printed data, inform the scientific process and the development of hypotheses and so on. And so it was through the course of developing some of these prototypes from multicellular structures, and I'm not going to go into the specifics of this, during the summer of 2009, that I realized that all of my knowledge in ceramics, I have a BFA in ceramics, which I thought I had long since left behind, was literally a body of knowledge. It was right here. And it was during a sweaty, sticky day in August in Philadelphia that I thought, well, this is powder material. Couldn't we potentially take that powder material out and put our own powder material in? And so this is an image of our first successful 3D printed greenware clay parts. So we took out the proprietary media, which costs about, at the time, $600 per bucket, mixed up my own recipe of a high-fire dry clay stoneware clay body, mixed with a little bit of sugar and maltodextrin, which you can find at any grocery store, and produced a bucket of material that cost about $2. So I was absolutely blown away by this, that we could literally print clay componentry. And that has opened up a research trajectory, both in my lab and my teaching and in my practice, on digital ceramics that started in 2009 and continues to flourish. So here you can see the same part printed in the regular media, and here printed with my recipe, bisque fired, so chemically changed to ceramics, and then glaze fired. And over the years, I've taught seminars and option studios on the topic of digital ceramics, where students engage clay as a material, but pushing that forward in the context of 3D printing, CNC mold machining, developing screen systems, walls, and so on, and leveraging the promise of 3D printing where every single part can be different. So they're bespoke, they're non-standard, but there's a coherence for how they come together in a coordinated fashion. In my lab, for the last 4 years, we've been focusing primarily on polybrick, focusing on the brick, which is very accessible and also has not changed for millennia. We could go back to the Roman Empire and the bricks pretty much look the same. And it precisely has to do with how they're made. But with 3D printing, we can begin to think about, again, non-standard components, the promise of hollow bricks, beginning to optimize for load path across a wall, and also to innovate strategies for connections. And so this was Polybrick 1.0. In Polybrick 2.0, after we've solved some of the technicalities, we have looked to nature for a set of design drivers, and here specifically looking to human bone formation to optimize for load path, but also to open up the promise for, the phenomena of a hollow wall, a porous wall, a wall that you can look through. And then more recently, working with Dan and his lab, Polybrick 3.0, developing a DNA glaze, looking at the promise and potential of glaze to not only be living, but potentially to clean the air of particulate matter. And we've had actually a lot more success than I thought we would in finding that clay is an incredible host for life. And I'm going to play a video that summarizes this latest work with some more visuals. The production of ceramic blocks and tiles has a long technological and design history. Ceramic modules of standard measurement have been used as building block and replacement of stone for many centuries. Ceramic bricks and tiles, so ubiquitous in their application in the built environment, have surprisingly lacked recognition as a viable building component in contemporary architecture practice until now. Polybrick, our latest endeavor under the topic of digital ceramics in the Sabin Design Lab at Cornell University, showcases next steps in the integration of complex phenomena. This work includes advances in digital technology, 3D printing, advanced geometry, and material practices in arts, crafts, and design disciplines. The first phase of the Polybrick series features the use of algorithmic design techniques for the digital fabrication and production of non-standard ceramic brick components for the mortarless assembly and installation of the first fully 3D printed and fired ceramic brick componentry. Polybrick 2.0 is generated with the rules, principles, and behavior of human bone formation. This allows for the production of variegated bricks that are light and porous at the top of the wall and dense at the base to carry load and maintain efficient structural integrity, while also amplifying material and formal expressions. Polybrick 3.0 takes our material investigations to the next level. Synthetically designed with advanced bioengineering, these biobricks will exemplify the cutting edge and future of biologically steered clay and ceramic building blocks in architecture. The two prototypes utilize 3D printed clay, hydrogel, and synthetic DNA. As you can see here, a unique ID stamped with DNA in the form of a C for Cornell is fluorescing within the polybrick clay body. Brick stamping has a long history where variegated size, shape, and stamping indicate place, date of construction, and type, and thus serve as invaluable historical documents. With our unique DNA stamps and glaze, we explore the possibility of live signatures and dynamic surface techniques, coupled with non-standard bricks in the context of living matter and digital ceramics. If you're interested in diving deep into the technical background of Polybrick, we have a couple of papers that have been recently published. You can find them on my website, and another one that's about to be published. And then briefly, probably the most mature project in my practice coming out of this work is Polymorph, which was also part of Archilab that the eSkin prototype was included in, and is now permanently housed at the FROC in Orléans, just outside of Paris. And this large-scale spatial prototype utilizes 3D printing in the context of digital ceramics, but in this case, we used it to optimize for mold design, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And it was here in this project that I took the years of deep inquiry and collaboration with Peter and our students into surface design of multicellular structures and looking at their morphologies, not as a one-to-one, but as a deep synthesis of understanding, of considering nodes, meeting nodes, how they form larger surfaces and bifurcate to form hierarchical structures, and considering how we might begin to spatialize a node. How might we begin to work with a few simple parts that through iteration could have multiple interweavings and coordinated assemblies. And so we settled on 3 parts after about 6 months of R&D that, as I mentioned, had about 253 ways of interweaving, 2 double surfaces, but with a very, very simple background logic based on an equilateral and isosceles triangle in terms of their bounding conditions, and use the 3D printer to optimize for mold design. So if any of you have done anything with slip casting, you probably know that to slip cast a complex part or a part with many undercuts is difficult to produce a very simple 2-part mold. And so through the development of some simple digital tools and algorithms, we 3D printed positive halves of those parts and then cast about 20 plaster molds, negative plaster molds, so that we could produce around 100 parts per day. So what started out as a fairly sophisticated digital process then became very slow and analog. And slip casting was very important in terms of the structure of this thing, because with slip casting it produces a hollow part, and so running internal to all of these high-fire ceramic components is a continuous network of stainless steel cable that's in tension. And that would bring all of the ceramic components into compression. So as it started to take shape, this became a rigid shell. It's now permanently housed here in the addition by Jacob and McFarlane within one of the large skylights, which they call the turbulences. And here, during I think it was week 3 of installation, you can start to see the sort of lacy woven configurations that these components are starting to take shape. I think we got the award for the longest installation. We were there for the better part of August when all of France shut down, not a single hardware store in sight open. But here you can see some of the final shots of it fully installed. Never again will I suspend 2,000 pounds of ceramic componentry in the air, but fortunately it's been there since 2013 and nothing has happened to it. And a little side story, one of the curators, Frederick Migrou, he and Marie-Ange Brère curated and started Archilab. He came through on one of the final days of installation and he looked at me and he said, "You are really smart." And I looked at him really worried and he said, "That's not going anywhere." And we had thought about how we would get it down, but we hadn't put a lot of thought into how we would get it down. And so fortunately, he really loved it, and he decided to bring it into the permanent collection. So it's not a sphere. Its topology has several inversions in terms of holes, and it changes quite a lot throughout the day with the shift in light. So that's Polymorph, one of those prototypes that has allowed us to kind of innovate and open up other trajectories within digital ceramics. Which brings me to my third and last topic, engaging adaptive environments. So we've talked about adaptive materials and fundamental research operating across disciplinary boundaries and scales, moving into part-to-whole relationships and non-standard structures with particular digital fabrication protocols, and now moving into adaptive environments and really considering how some of these ideas, topics, and research trajectories can perhaps begin to operate at the scale of the built environment, and importantly, engage with humans. I'm going to briefly start with, I'm going to talk about 2 projects only, but I'm going to start with the Beacon, which was a recent collaboration with Peter. We joined forces again in 2016. At that time, he was at Thomas Jefferson University, which is the oldest medical college in the country. And he started an innovative unit there called Med Studio, so bringing design into the curriculum of medicine and considering how doctors are taught and engaging hybrid thinking in that context. And the Beacon really was to serve as an interface in an urban context, in a very public context. It was a part of Design Philadelphia. And this project, as an interface, the intention was that it would open up communication, probe new questions around medicine, issues of health and wellness, technology, and design. And also importantly, that it would be playful and that it would be a point of gathering and then it would bring people together from multiple backgrounds, disciplinary areas of expertise, and so on. It was sited on Jefferson's campus in Philadelphia, right downtown. And the Beacon is approximately 25 feet tall. It's composed of a series of steel modules with an internal network of digitally knit conical forms. And importantly, the big leap that we decided to take on was to work with a key protagonist or set of protagonists, these little drones. And so early on, I said to my team, we're going to weave with drones. And they looked at me like I was absolutely crazy. And we did. We managed to pull it off. And so over the course of 10 days, the Beacon gained an exterior skin that was woven every night by the drones. And the density of that, the patterning of the skin, which was photoluminescent microcord. You can see the little end effector, quite simple, that these little guys carried around. And the steel modules at the edges featured a detail that basically did this, which would catch the microcord as they spun around the Beacon. And so the patterning and the density reflected people's collective participation with various interfaces, primarily through an app that was developed by Peter's team, asking questions about health and wellness and medicine, big data, and so on. And so the Beacon itself literally materialized people's participation within the project. It also became quite a spectacle. Every night, people would gather and engage in conversation and watch the drones. I'm not going to play this video, but if you Google the Beacon, Thomas Jefferson, Philadelphia, and our names, you'll find this. It's quite fun. The technologies that were a part of the Beacon, and importantly the concepts, really grew out of a body of work that started in 2012 as part of a commission that came to me from Nike. I'm not going to talk about that project tonight, but I'll mention a couple of key moments that came out of that project that influenced Lumen for MoMA and MoMA PS1, which was my winning entry and the final built project for the Young Architects program in 2017. As you can see, it takes an army of people to pull these projects off. It's a project that is really our project and the result of many professionals and students and my team pulling off Herculean feats to realize it. But just to talk a little bit about my thread, which was the pavilion I developed for Nike. They, in 2012, were about to launch a technology, Flynet, which you all know very well now. And as a part of that, they invited 6 people from around the world, designers and artists, to riff on the core benefits of Flynet, which included form-fitting, sustainability, performance, adaptation, and so on. And they were genuinely interested in how we might bring those core benefits back into our own fields and disciplines. I represented the States. My city was New York City, and I pitched to them that I wanted to work with knitting. I thought it was really obvious, and they were really surprised. And so I was interested in considering how the pavilion could be produced through the integration of the simplicity of the computational nature and craft of knitting with the dynamics of a series of biodata sets coming forth from the human body. And so the final pavilion was not a representation or a mapping of that data, but that data, in terms of each single data point, was attached to parameters inherent to knitting, density, holes, striation patterns, and so on, so that the pavilion itself became generated and constructed by the data, in this case from 30 participants that we outfitted with sensors and had them go out into New York City and so on. And this was the first time that I also started to work with 2 high-tech responsive fibers. So leveraging all of the thinking and the work that we have been doing with structural color and wavelength-dependent color change, programmable matter, and so on, into thinking about yarns that could, through knitting and in some cases weaving, produce larger scale transformations and responses. And so in this project, we worked with photoluminescent fibers and solar active fibers. Photoluminescent yarns absorb energy from the sun or a UV light source, and when that energy source goes away, the photons get agitated and then they release that light, so they glow. So hence what I call knitted light. And then the solar active yarns change color immediately in the presence of the sun or a UV light source. And what's happening actually in the presence of a UV light source, these little crystalline structures within the yarn enlarge ever so slightly and push the behavior of light into a level of the electromagnetic spectrum that allows us to perceive that color change. So again, thinking about the behavior of light and human perception. And another project, this time for the Cooper Hewitt polythread, which was in 2015 as a part of their triennial, which was titled Beauty. I was interested in, again, leveraging the kind of deep inquiry into surface design of cellular structures and their morphology, not as a one-to-one again, but thinking about how all of that research and tool production could begin to influence a way of thinking about architecture, its flexibility, its non-standard nature, and how its dynamics could be leveraged at multiple scales. And in this project, I also started working with Arup Engineering to really start to fine-tune how these knit surfaces were behaving in terms of the transmission of tension forces, and using that data to then bolster our tools. There, at the time were no tools out there available for us to work with. We had to develop our own tools and simulation models to work with these knit structures. And then finally, this was the first time that I started to work with a double surface. So there was this kind of poché space between the interior and the exterior, where structurally speaking, the cones actually operate as springs, right? So getting the tension to work just right throughout the whole project was incredibly important. And so it was this photograph, actually, this space between the two surfaces that really served as a kind of point of departure and inspiration and obsession for what Lumen could potentially be. To consider the promise of inhabiting a space like this, where you have this kind of upper ground, a canopy world, and a lower ground, the actual ground, connected through programs that have correspondences. I'm going to play this in the background as I talk about some of the specifics of Lumen. This was our proposal video, which I played on the day that I presented the project to the jury, which is a day I will never forget. It was a pretty formidable jury composed of curators from MoMA and MoMA PS1, architects, and beyond. And if you don't know about the Young Architects program, it happens once a year It's one of the most important competitions for emerging architects. And 5 finalists are selected from about 30 people that are nominated. And those 5 finalists have about 6 weeks to produce a proposal for the installation that takes place in the courtyards at MoMA PS1 in Long Island City. For the proposal, we developed a full VR model. It was really important to me that the jury would understand, at least in simulation mode, how Lumen would be responsive, that they would understand its transformational nature, that it would be quite different from day to night, and that it would operate as an environment, not as an object. And I think the VR model was quite important as an asset, so the jurors were able to put on the goggles and really get a sense of what the spaces might be and how the materials might respond. This is my robot Sola in my lab. A part of the brief requires that you engage issues of recycling and sustainability and also seating, and so I decided to integrate some of those topics and parameters into the actual seating. These are recycled spools, cable spools. We deconstructed them, CNC'd the tops and bottoms, or the caps, and then for the prototypes, wove around those stools with a photoluminescent microcord, kind of building upon some of the things that we learned with the beacon, this time toning it down a little bit. We weren't going to do that with drones. We importantly worked with the site quite extensively. One aspect of the brief also entails a project that will provide shade. It gets quite hot in these courtyards during the summer months, and also they require that you integrate water in some fashion. And so Lumen features a comprehensive misting system that runs on top of the largest canopy structure, and then feeder lines, and you can see in the VR model here, drop down into the cones, and each cone is then shaped with basically hoops of the tubing that then had at least 2 misting nozzles on each one, and so you could walk through Lumen and you would get gently misted, and it actually worked quite well to cool down the climate. So this was the first time that I took the photoluminescent yarns outside, where we actually worked with the sun instead of only a simulated lighting experience. And this was that kind of magic moment right at dusk when the photoluminescent fibers would start to release all of the energy that had been absorbed throughout the day from the sun, and you get this kind of magical glow across the entire project. The project features 2 canopies, a smaller one and a much larger one. This is about 100 feet by 80 feet approximately. So we also jumped in scale. And I knew strategically if we were going to possibly win that I had to really leverage a material system that I felt confident in. And so all of the work that had started in 2012 with Nike was really ready to be pushed to this scale and to be pushed outside and to be occupied by thousands of people. There are 3 towers, 2 in the main courtyard and 1 in the smaller courtyard. And those towers are tensegrity structures, and I'll come back to those in a moment. And for me, it was very important that the public would really own Lumen, that they would make Lumen theirs, and that they would have different experiences depending on whether they would visit during the weekend on warm-up, when they invite DJs from around the world to perform, or during the week just simply having lunch during the weekday. And so these ebbs and flows of activity were incredibly important in terms of the programming of the project. And so within the hundreds of digitally knit cones and cells, which incorporate what's called whole garment technology, and what that means is that we're knitting in 3D. So these cones are knit in 3D without a seam. And so the programs entailed groves that would connect to the ground to create these kind of areas for clustering. It included the misting corridor, which happened in this area, as well as seeding that could be moved throughout both of the courtyards. These are just a couple of drawings highlighting the stools again and how they came together with the early prototypes engaging the robot in my lab. So we also leveraged research that was ongoing in the lab as a way of kind of really testing at scale. And of course, considering how this would change from day to night, a rendering featuring the photoluminescent yarns, and here it actually performing. At night, we did have a comprehensive lighting system to amplify the photoluminescent and solar active yarns. And here you can see the solar active fibers as a rendering and performing fully installed with the sort of subtle pinks and yellows. I've been working with Daisian fabrics now for a number of years. They work at 1-to-1, so again, what starts out as a very sophisticated digital process. None of this would be possible without the coordinated effort of digital tools and algorithms and generative processes. But the finishing and the sewing becomes quite slow and analog. So we produce these extremely large drawings that are the scale of the actual canopy, and they talked about how they started on the West Coast and ended on the East Coast. A couple of little sort of fun side notes. We had 2 hidden zippers, one here and one here, so that we wouldn't have to literally lift the canopy up and over these 43-foot tall towers, but we could just unzip them like a skirt, go around the tower and zip them back up. So here are some images of it fully installed. You can see, again, how we're using the existing matrix of concrete courtyard walls to stitch into. I will say we had a interesting and creative budget, a series of budget constraints to work within. So we had to innovate around that and come up with some, in many cases, off-the-shelf details. Here you can see a detail of it literally stitching into the walls. I learned so much from now a long-time collaborator, Clayton Binkley, who's with Arup. He was the lead engineer on this project, where we were really able to riff on things together and realize this at a scale that otherwise hadn't been possible before. This is a detail of the misting corridor from above, and a shot on the opening night. And a few photographs of the smaller courtyard, which was actually one of my favorite spaces. We did all kinds of shaping of the cells. So in this canopy structure, we shaped in terms of how the digital knitting programs were coordinated, each cell to have a little bit of a lip. And so when the wind would come through the courtyards, everything was dynamic, right? So they would start to flutter and ripple, and the shadows were actually pretty incredible during the day. As I mentioned, the towers are tensegrity structures, just again to make it that much more complicated. But it was important because it offered a third sort of envelope of equilibrium. This notion of adaptation and responsivity, being something that is very much a part of the structure. So each tower features a flying ring, a steel compressive mast, and a diagrid of ropes that were made by a company in Seattle that typically makes products for the fishing industry. I think I really made the curator at MoMA PS1 nervous the day that we put the first one up, and we kept saying, no, it's going to work, it's going to work, it's going to work. And it, of course they did. But just a couple of side details in terms of how we erected this. We did do some creative rigging at night when nobody was around. But we basically built an easel that the mast would rest against. The ring was on the ground. We laced everything up and then slowly started to hoist it with a boom lift, and then started to tension everything up. And so when the tension got to a certain point, the mast lifted off of the easel, right, and started to slowly get into place. We had U-bolts on the bottom, so we could adjust it and fine-tune it as we needed. And then there was, at the top of the mast, a hardware component that we could move up and down as needed with just how the tension was operating. We did pre-stress all of the ropes on site. We had this giant stretcher. Everybody got their workout in for the first week or so, because we didn't want to have to go back and retension everything once everything was up. But I think for me, the most important part of this project and the kind of moment of success in terms of realizing the project was seeing how people used it, and again, how they made it their own project. They weren't supposed to climb the towers, but of course they did. This is a photograph taken during warm-up. We did engineer them to consider that. I didn't really think this was going to happen, but this was a typical warm-up. We would see about 7,000 people on any given Saturday. And the project ended up being in the top 10 in terms of the most Instagrammed art and design project in the world. So people really loved Lumen, which was really awesome. And so you can see just how it would be used both during the day and also in the evenings. The success of this project and its international sort of appeal has opened up some very exciting new trajectories in my practice, where we're now starting to push this into permanent built projects. I have a couple of projects in the Middle East, large outdoor canopy structures, also some permanent projects in the Seattle area and in Portland, which is super exciting. So, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, I am a maker at heart, and although the research and the collaborations keep me going every day, and the teaching and engaging with my students, I've always fundamentally been interested in how this will impact architecture and the way that we think and design, and how these topics and technologies meet the built environment, and importantly, how we as humans interact with them. Because I think there's something about these types of morphologies and spaces and structures that really resonate with us, that resonate with our bodies, where we're able to move away from the kind of typical elements that we're used to: columns, beams, arches, Cartesian orders that have borders and boundaries that are closed, perhaps on a meta level, more masculine, into material organizations that are generative, that are non-standard, that are open and fibrous, that don't necessarily have borders or edges, and offer up different types of elements that in some ways I think perhaps are closer to our own selves. So with that, I'm going to conclude. I think I've gone a little bit over time, but I've shown you some highlights. There's a lot of work, both in the practice and the lab. I invite you to visit us. We've been fortunate to receive quite a lot of funding over the years, which has allowed us to really go far and go deep. And also importantly, we are a we. I obviously don't work alone. I have the good fortune of working with incredible professionals, collaborators, students, research associates, senior designers, and beyond. And I will say, I recently launched a new program in architecture at Cornell called Matter Design Computation. It's a 2-year advanced research degree and purposefully does not require a prior professional degree in architecture, because the intent is to not only have designers and architects engaged in this advanced research degree, but also biologists, artists, material scientists, engineers, and so on. We have our next cohort coming in the fall, so take a look where you can find us online. And I'm going to end here. I'll play this in the background. It's a short film that documents Lumen, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thanks so much for staying and for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was a phenomenal lecture. We have to be out of this room by 6:50, but we have a few minutes for questions. So there are 2 mics here at the back. I have one, and we have another one on the other side of the room. If you have a question for Jenny, please come ask.
Hi. So did the blue of the photoluminescence that was in Lumen, did that impact people's behavior, like, nearby? I know that blue light affects people sometimes.
I wish we had done some rigorous what we call post-occupancy analysis, because so many people came up to me and also my team and were just emotive about how they felt in the project. People talked about how they wished that Lumen was in their child's playground. They wished that Lumen was in their local hospital. They wished that Lumen was in their local park. And people also really loved the way that it changed and the colors, in terms of their responsivity. So the exact answer to your question, no, but did people respond to what was going on here in terms of its transformational nature? Absolutely. But that's something that I wish we had done and will definitely do in the future.
Question here from Dan. Hold on one second.
Thank you so much. We both, we being UC Davis and Cornell, are both big agriculture schools. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or plans about agriculture in your practice, your research, and just in general about transdisciplinarity.
Everybody loved the cones. That's a great question. But yeah, our ag program is phenomenal. As you know, Cornell is also part land-grant school. I'm not formally collaborating with faculty and researchers in agriculture. In the past, I have integrated live plant matter in sort of urban settings. There was a project called the Greenhouse and Cabinet of Future Fossils that I did in Philadelphia for a particular project that was in the Jefferson Garden. And that integrated as a kind of surface, a live surface, various scales of plant matter. But no, I'm not currently. It's not that I'm not interested. But.
I think we have to wrap it up. I do want to make an announcement about Jenny's schedule tomorrow, because one fantastic part of the Alberini Lecture Series is that she spends time with students. So she'll be meeting with our graduate students tomorrow for lunch. And then there's an open Q&A from 1 to 2 for design undergraduates to come meet with her. We will start in Cruise Hall 144. If there's too many people, we'll move to room 108. But design undergrads, please come talk to Jenny in person tomorrow. Thanks again to the Alberinis for making this possible. Thank you, Jenny, for an amazing lecture. Thank you, everyone, for staying.
Thank you.